best can investors recoup their investments from oil and gas free zones? And which free zones best suit specific investments, green fields or brown fields? The search for answers to these questions and more posed by investors prompted the Oil and Gas Free Zones Authority to work with PwC on a diagnostic report.
The report was put together at the request of the Oil and Gas Free Zone Authority, and the whole idea of that report was to take a detailed look at the different free zones that are under the purview of the Oil and Gas Free Zone Authority, OGFZA, and then select or rank which of the green fields should be the focus of investments that will attract FDIs, and rank the brown fields, which will be the focus of additional investments by different businesses. And that process took a few months because a lot of research has to be done, a lot of detailed diagnosis has to be done in terms of identifying what kind of investments will be most appreciated by people who are seeking to make investments in the zone.
What we did was to compare these various OGFZA free zones. There are about 10 of them, 4 of them which are active, 6 of them inactive or in the process of development. And we compare them in terms of availability of space, in terms of occupancy, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of proximity to the market, and in terms of access to transportation, i.e. port access. Some of them are better situated in terms of all these various characteristics than others. We found out that Notori and Onne are doing exceptionally well, and actually, if you look at the FDI intelligence, which is a publication by the Financial Times that ranks free zones around the world, they typically rank Onne and Notori as among the best free zones in the world for oil and gas. And so that came up in our benchmark analysis as well.
On the greenfield side, Ipokiri, which is 2 kilometers from Onne, was the preferred zone of interest. And so what you have is a case where Ipokiri is the place where we think is going to be the next Onne, right? Onne is very popular, is well known outside the shores of this country. And so we know that with the traction and with the success that was made out of Onne, Ipokiri is very likely to be the next free zone that the authority is going to be showcasing.
These professionals measure free zones under the OGFZA against one another, highlight the nature of fields fit for specific investment types, benchmark them against their counterparts across the world, and assess cost benefits that accrue from location benchmarking.
When you talk about benchmarking, you pretty much are talking about how you compare one item to the other, right? And usually in the benchmarking exercise, it's usually to bring out areas where you can improve and areas where you're doing well, right? What comes to mind is how are we doing how are the oil and gas free zone authorities in Nigeria doing when you compare them to the way the authorities in other free zones in other territories operate. And the best way to measure the effectiveness of an authority is actually the performance of the zone itself, the zones that they have jurisdiction over. So you think about a free zone like the Tangier Med free zone in Morocco, and the Tangier Med has about 600 companies operating within the zone. It's had FDIs of about $15 billion as a last count. There's a lot of exports going through the zone, so there's a lot of activity. And it's ranked #1 because of the ease of doing business, some of the incentives that come by way of doing business within that zone. It's known to have some of the best living conditions in Africa. So you look at even you look at a place like One. One is also ranks quite high when it comes to oil and gas zone operations. The interesting thing about One is that One is the only dedicated oil and gas free zone where oil and gas activities, where the focus is on oil and gas activities. And One has been instrumental to the circa $20 billion worth of FDI that has come in country. This is a reported speech by the Minister of Trade and Investment. And about 200,000 jobs being created in One as well as some of the other trade zones. So I mean, with some of these things I'm saying, you can see that as far as the zone operations are concerned, there's a lot of progress. There's a lot of positives to take out of it.
The agglomeration of some of these free zones around each other. So One, Notori, Ipokri, they're all within a certain radius of each other and sort of benefiting a lot from the infrastructure development that has already happened. As of right now, there is conversation about bringing on stream a gas pipeline onto One, from which gas could be supplied to furnaces, to turbines, to ovens. So in terms of sharing infrastructure, which helps to reduce costs, there's a great deal of advantage in that. With that said, for the zones that do not have these infrastructure advantages, it tends to be a bit of a struggle, because then you have to procure your own source of power, you have to develop your own helipads, you have to sort of build your own port accesses, and then it makes the cost quite expensive if you are a bit further removed from the sort of the core oil and gas zone.
For stakeholders, tracking the inflow of foreign direct investments into the country through the oil and gas free zones remains a major matrix in the benchmarking and assessment of the essence of the OGFZA.
Well, I'll tell you that the OGFZA has different free zones that it looks after, because they are the authority, right? And if you're going to compare the One zone with other zones, I think it's done quite well. It's done quite well when you benchmark with the amount of jobs that were created, the amount of FDI, because FDI is a major matrix when you're looking at trade zones, because the whole idea of setting up a trade zone is because you're trying to attract FDIs, you're trying to attract industry, and so when the FDIs start to come in, it's usually a measure of how industrialized that zone has become. So the truth of the matter is, when it comes to greenfields, it's really a story of the economy, right? It's a story of, so as far as Nigeria is concerned, greenfield investments or investments in a greenfield is only a reflection of how the people's appetite of investments in Nigeria, right? So things like security, things like the level of literacy of people, things like the available markets, so supply chain, those are things that now matter when it comes to making a greenfield investment. I have to put in some basic infrastructure, right? And those things, the infrastructure actually sometimes is very capital intensive. And so the question will be, if I make this investment, is there the scope, right? Is there the scope? Is there the means by which I can reclaim or recover my investments in this zone?
what I have seen, I think they are taking steps in the right direction to sort of make their impact really felt. Rarely do you see a regulatory body take an active role in promoting the area that they are supposed to regulate. Typically, regulators would make rules, enforce rules, and mete out punishments when these rules are flouted. But OGFZA is taking the added step of actually supporting these zones by conducting investor roadshows, doing the diagnostic that they brought us in to do, and speaking with investors and trying to bring in actual investment into these zones. This will give a lot of confidence to investors that this is not a passive regulator, this is a very active regulator, this is a forward-thinking regulator. So I think it's a step in the right direction and something that should be encouraged.
I think one thing that you can see here is where you have zones, it generally tends to bring a lot of FDIs, and with those FDIs comes a lot of economic development, a lot of economic empowerment, a lot of job creation, and I think it's just the impetus that any developing country will need to launch itself into the next level.